So we've touched upon the foundational ideas of Pyrrhonism and Sextus' introduction. Now, let's dive into a fascinating puzzle. How does Sextus actually employ his skeptical toolkit? We know he talks about phrases like no more or up to now, suggesting limits to knowledge. But looking at his actual writing, these phrases aren't everywhere you might expect, based on his own description in PH1. It's like he's holding back some of his aces. This naturally makes us wonder, if he's not just relying on those specific phrases, what other methods is he using to keep us, the readers, constantly questioning, to nudge us towards that state of suspension of judgment, the aporia? I think there's a clever strategy here, something I'm calling variation. First up, let's look at the word philosophy itself. It's a bit of a head-scratcher with Sextus. On one hand, he seems perfectly comfortable using it. Right off the bat in PH1, he's listing the three main branches: logic, physics, ethics, and boom, skepticism is one of them. He even calls himself a Pyrrhonian philosopher. Sounds straightforward, right? But then, almost immediately, he starts using this phrase, what is called philosophy. Suddenly, it feels like he's putting air quotes around the whole enterprise. He does this repeatedly, sometimes in the very same paragraph where he just referred to skeptical philosophy. It's like he's saying, yeah, people call this stuff philosophy, but let's be real. This isn't a minor slip, it happens consistently, especially in the outlines. So why this constant flip-flopping with the term philosophy? What's the point? Well, think about what philosophy usually implies. Does it mean a quest for certain definitive answers about reality? Or does it just mean any serious, deep thinking about fundamental questions? If it's the former definition, maybe skepticism has a point questioning whether such certainty is even possible. But if it's the latter, well then, calling a Pyrrhonian a philosopher seems perfectly reasonable. Sextus doesn't try to settle this debate. Instead, he lets both interpretations hang there unresolved. He keeps us guessing about what philosophy even is, and by extension, where skepticism fits in. It's like he's saying, you want to do philosophy? Go ahead, I'm not playing that game. The important thing is that we're all confused about it. It's a subtle way to keep undermining confidence, pushing the uncertainty right up to the meta level. Okay, moving on from the label philosophy, let's look at another area of ambiguity: Sextus' relationship with ordinary life. Again, it's not simple. Sometimes he paints a picture of the skeptic as pretty much one of us. He says, look, we use everyday signs, smoke means fire, just like everyone else, that's fine. He nods approvingly at practical skills like reading or knowing the weather. He says skeptics follow laws and customs, not some abstract theory. In fact, he explicitly states they live according to non-philosophical practice, guided by what society dictates. It sounds like the skeptic is just a normal person, avoiding unnecessary theorizing. But wait, just when you think you've got it figured out, Sextus flips the script again. He points out that ordinary folks, the many, believe in gods and that motion exists. These are the common beliefs, the backdrop against which philosophers argue. And guess who often ends up on the opposite side of these debates? Yep, the skeptics, suspending judgment on both. So is the skeptic in tune with ordinary life or against it? Sextus doesn't give us a clear answer. He presents these conflicting pictures side by side. Is the skeptic just like us, or fundamentally different? Like with the term philosophy, he leaves us hanging. This deliberate ambiguity forces us to wrestle with the very nature of skepticism's place in the world, leading once again towards that elusive state of suspension of judgment. Now, let's talk about how Sextus structures his arguments, specifically when he sets up these famous oppositions. You'd think, if his goal is to show both sides equally, he'd give them roughly equal time and attention. And sometimes, he does. There are sections with lengthy summaries of pro and con arguments. But much more often, the skeptical side, the negative arguments, tends to dominate the discussion. Why? Well, one reason given is that the dogmatic arguments are often taken as background noise, assumed plausible. Or the non-skeptical view is just presented as plain experience, not needing detailed argumentation. But here's a crucial insight from Sextus himself. He says the skeptic naturally focuses on the more counterintuitive side. Why? To achieve equality in the strength of the opposing impressions. Think about it. Denying something obvious like motion requires a stronger argument than affirming it based on experience. So, the prevalence of negative arguments isn't just laziness, it's a calculated move to create genuine intellectual tension, pushing us towards suspension. But it gets even trickier. Even when Sextus does seem to lay out both sides, the structure can feel a bit off. Take the criterion of truth in Against the Logicians. Before launching into the big arguments against any criterion, he spends a lot of time surveying all the different views on the criterion, including some that seem to support it. It's like setting the stage, but the stage itself becomes part of the performance, blurring the lines before the main act begins. Similarly, in the discussion against motion, he brings in Diodorus Cronus, seemingly as an ally, but then throws in critiques of Diodorus and even Diodorus' own responses, casting doubt on the very arguments he's using. It's like watching a magician misdirect your attention. And this isn't just sloppy organization. Especially in the longer works like Against the Logicians, Physicists, and Ethicists, there are moments where the reader's expectations are deliberately subverted. Maybe he promises a positive argument, then immediately juxtaposes it with a negative one. Could this lack of perfect systematic clarity be intentional? Perhaps he wants to keep us slightly off balance, preventing us from settling comfortably into any single viewpoint, another way to nudge us towards that suspended state. This leads us to perhaps the most mind-bending possibility. Earlier we noted the tension between Sextus presenting himself as an inquirer, searching for truth, and his method of generating opposing arguments to induce suspension. How can you be both searching for truth and giving up on finding it? It seems contradictory, but what if Sextus is deliberately making it ambiguous what skepticism itself entails? What if he's playing with our understanding of what inquiry means? This might sound a bit postmodern, maybe even anachronistic, but consider it. If skepticism's core is precisely its refusal to commit to a single definition or method, then this ambiguity wouldn't be a flaw but a feature. It connects directly to the fuzziness around terms like philosophy and the uncertain status of the skeptic in ordinary life. It's another layer of strategic elusiveness. All right, let's shift gears slightly. We've seen how Sextus plays with language and structure. Now, let's look at a different aspect of his work. Why he seems keen to emphasize that Pyrrhonism is different from other philosophies. Think about the ancient world. Philosophers love tracing their lineage back to big names Plato, Socrates, Heraclitus, Democritus. It was a way to show respect, legitimacy, maybe even a shared intellectual heritage. The Stoics pointed to Socrates and Heraclitus. The Epicureans highlighted Democritus. Later schools were defined by their relation to Plato or Aristotle. But Sextus? He's surprisingly quiet about his own history. Pyrrho gets a brief mention, Anisidmus isn't discussed much. And then, in a major chunk of PH Book 1, he goes out of his way to argue that Pyrrhonism is distinct from a whole bunch of other philosophies he calls nearby. Why this insistence on being different, especially when everyone else seemed happy to acknowledge connections? So, who were these nearby philosophies that Sextus felt needed distinguishing? He takes aim at Heraclitus, Democritus, the Cyrenaics, Protagoras, the Academy, and the Empiric School of Medicine. Why these specific ones? Well, there's evidence, mainly from Diogenes Laertius, that some people thought of figures like Homer, Xenophanes, Democritus, Heraclitus, Zeno, and Protagoras as pro-skeptics, thinkers who had skeptical leanings before Pyrrho. Sextus is clearly responding to this perception. But where did these ideas come from? Was it the Pyrrhonists themselves trying to build a respectable lineage? Or was it critics trying to undermine skepticism by showing it wasn't really new? Or maybe neutral historians just classifying different schools of thought? The text doesn't give us a definitive answer, leaving us to ponder the origins of these perceived similarities. Let's start with Heraclitus. This is interesting because Anisidmus, another key figure in the Pyrrhonist tradition, apparently saw a connection. He suggested skepticism could be a route to Heraclitus, based on the idea that opposites appear to apply to the same thing, like hot and cold, day and night. Accepting this appearance, Anisidmus thought, could lead one to accept the reality of opposites applying together, which is a core Heraclitean idea. But Sextus? He slams the door shut. First, he points out that Heraclitus himself was dogmatic. He made definite claims about reality. Second, he argues that the starting point, the idea that opposites appear to apply, is just common sense, a prolepsis, nothing special to skepticism. It's like saying, yeah, we both see the same rainbow, but that doesn't make us the same color. Sextus is adamant, even rejecting any hint of a connection, even with a fellow Pyrrhonist founder. He wants no association with Heraclitus at all. Moving on to Democritus and Protagoras, Sextus tones down the vehemence a bit, but the focus remains on difference. For Democritus, the claim of commonality supposedly comes from his use of the phrase no more, after discussing relativity, like honey being sweet to one and bitter to another. Sextus counters, Democritus uses no more to deny both options, making a dogmatic claim, It's neither sweet nor bitter in reality, while skeptics use it to express indecision. Plus, Democritus famously asserts atoms and void, a definite theory. With Protagoras, the link supposedly his man is the measure doctrine, implying relativism. Sextus interprets this doctrine more radically. It means the world changes to match our perceptions, making Protagoras committed to dogmatic claims about how things are, just different ones. Again, the conclusion is starkly different from skepticism. It's less about denying similarity outright, and more about showing the underlying commitments diverge completely. The Cyrenaics offer a clearer case. Some argued they were the same as skeptics, because both seemed to say we only grasp sensations or ways we are affected. Sextus refutes this easily. First, they have totally different goals: pleasure versus tranquility. Second, unlike the skeptic who suspends judgment, the Cyrenaics make a definite claim about external things having an inapprehensible nature. They're not avoiding commitment. They're making a negative assertion. So they fit the mold of negative dogmatists, not skeptics. Here, the distinction is pretty clear-cut. Now the Academy, this is complex. And Aesidemus himself broke away from the Academy, suggesting a history of tension. And indeed, there was debate, even in Sextus' time, about whether the academic skeptics were truly the same as Pyrrhonists. Sextus tackles this head-on, distinguishing between different phases. Plato? Nope, too dogmatic. Xenophanes? Partial skepticism doesn't count. The new Academy under Carneades and Clitomachus? They assert things are unknowable negative dogmatism, and treat some impressions as more persuasive than others, meaning they hold opinions. Even the later academics Philo and Antiochus are clearly different. The most intriguing case is Arcesilaus, generally seen as the founder of academic skepticism. Sextus starts by saying their outlooks are almost the same. But then, he immediately throws in two alternative interpretations. Maybe Arcesilaus was just dogmatic in his delivery, or maybe he was secretly a Platonist using skepticism as a filter. He doesn't endorse these, but he leaves them floating, making Arcesilaus' true relation to Pyrrhonism ambiguous. Finally, medical empiricism. Sextus, himself an empiricist, argues against identifying Pyrrhonism with this school. He sets a condition. If empiricists claimed things were unknowable, they'd be negative dogmatists. Since they don't seem to go that far, he pivots to arguing that Methodism, another medical approach, would actually be more suitable for a skeptic. Interestingly, this is similar to the Arcesilaus case. Here, Sextus acknowledges a kinship, oikeiotes, a kind of family resemblance, without immediately trying to tear it down. Unlike the other nearby philosophies, he doesn't feel the need to stress differences as much. It's a qualified similarity, perhaps, but one he seems more willing to accept. So, what's the big picture here? Across the board, Sextus is incredibly resistant to any suggestion that Pyrrhonism is the same as, or even very similar to, other philosophies. This applies even when the comparison comes from within his own Pyrrhonipist, like the Anaxidemus-Heraclitus link. Contrast this sharply with the skeptical academics, who were constantly looking back to Socrates and Plato, and arguing amongst themselves about who was the true heir. Why this extreme defensiveness from Sextus? Why this relentless drive to say, we are different? The simplest explanation is probably the best one. Sextus genuinely believes Pyrrhonism is a fundamentally different kind of intellectual activity. It's not just a slightly different flavor of philosophy. It's a different category altogether. Let's call the dominant conception of philosophy in his time philosophy D. The idea that philosophy is about systematic inquiry, aiming for secure, definite knowledge about reality, constructing theories, figuring things out. Think Plato, Aristotle, and their followers. If this is what philosophy D means, then Sextus' position becomes clear. He's not doing philosophy D. His goal isn't to build a system or discover truth, but to suspend judgment. Therefore, he has nothing to do with philosophy D and wants to make sure everyone knows it. And here's where it gets really interesting, connecting back to the emphasis on difference. In Sextus' time, and increasingly so, claiming a link to a respected historical figure was vital for a philosopher's credibility. It showed you were part of a respected tradition. If Sextus sees Pyrrhonism as fundamentally outside philosophy D, then rejecting any connections to predecessors, even those who might seem relevant, makes perfect sense. It's a way of saying, our purity is absolute, we're not contaminated by the dogmatic traditions of the past. Associating with anyone, even a respected Heraclitus or Plato, risks making Pyrrhonism look like just another branch of philosophy D, complete with its baggage of definite claims. For Sextus, avoiding that risk, maintaining the radical purity of skepticism, seems paramount. Pedigree matters less than the integrity of the method. So, wrapping up, what we see in Sextus isn't necessarily carelessness or inconsistency. Those variations in terminology, the shifting stance on ordinary life, the unbalanced arguments, the surprising structures, they likely serve a purpose. They are tools in a deliberate strategy. The aim seems to be twofold. First, to keep the reader perpetually engaged, uncertain, and nudged towards that state of suspension of judgment. Second, to fiercely defend the radical uniqueness of Pyrrhonism by drawing sharp lines around it, rejecting any associations, even with potential predecessors, to maintain its perceived purity. It's all part of a larger project to establish Pyrrhonism not as a philosophy in the traditional sense, but as a distinct path to tranquility through the suspension of judgment.